Are you ready to level up your experience on YouTube? Because this channel is all about bringing you fresh ideas, exciting content, and something worth your time. If that sounds like what you're looking for, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned.
The morning I found out, I was standing in our kitchen making coffee, still in my robe, completely ordinary. My husband had left for work early or so, he said. His laptop was open on the counter, a habit he'd never broken in 12 years of marriage. I wasn't snooping. I was reaching past it to grab a mug when the screen lit up with a notification. A calendar reminder. Consult Baxter and Howe Family Law. Thursday 9 a.m. Confirmed. I stood there with my hand around the mug handle and read it 3 times. Baxter and Howe wasn't a name I knew. But family law, I knew exactly what that meant. That was a Tuesday. By Thursday, I had already made my own appointment. Not with a divorce attorney. With a forensic accountant. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning, because none of what happened at the end makes sense unless you understand what the 12 years before it looked like and, more importantly, what they actually were, underneath everything I thought I knew. My husband and I met when I was 26 and he was 31. He was the kind of man who filled a room without trying, not loud, just certain. Certain of himself, certain of his opinions, certain that the world would arrange itself around him if he waited long enough. I found that attractive once. Later I would understand it for what it was. We built something together, or I believed we did. He had the ideas and the connections. I had the financial background. I'd spent 4 years as a senior analyst at an accounting firm before we got married, and I understood numbers the way some people understand music. Intuitively. Structurally. I could look at a balance sheet and hear it. When the rhythm was off, I felt it before I could name it. So when my husband decided to launch his own business, a mid-size logistics consulting firm, I was the one who set up the financial infrastructure. I designed the accounting systems. I negotiated the first vendor contracts. I stayed up until 2 in the morning in the early years building the models that kept us solvent when cash flow was tight. He was the face. I was the foundation. His best friend from college, a man I'll call my brother-in-law by choice because that's what he felt like. He used to joke that the company would collapse in 48 hours without me. My husband used to laugh at that joke. Later I realized it made him uncomfortable. We never had children. That was a grief we carried separately and never quite found a way to share. It made us closer for a while. In the way that shared losses sometimes do. Then it made us strangers. I think the distance had been growing for years before I was willing to see it. The trips he took alone, conferences, he said, client dinners. The passwords that changed, the way he started holding his phone face down on every surface. I told myself I was imagining things. I was good at that. Analysts are trained to trust the data, not the instinct. I kept waiting for data. I got it on a Tuesday morning in October, standing barefoot on the kitchen tile, holding a coffee mug I forgot to fill. My best friend had been in my life since we were both 22 and newly arrived in the same city, lost and ambitious in equal measure. We had been through everything together, her divorce, my miscarriages, job changes, cross-country moves, the slow accumulation of a real friendship that feels more like family than most family does. Or that's what I thought it was. I didn't know yet, that Tuesday morning, about her. I only knew about the attorney. I put the mug down. I closed the laptop. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, very still, the way I used to sit at my desk when I'd found an error in a set of accounts and needed to think before I touched anything. Then I made a list. Not of feelings. Of facts. Of questions that needed answers before I did anything else. The forensic accountant I contacted was a woman named Sandra, who had been recommended to me years earlier by a colleague and whose card I had kept without knowing why. I called her that same Thursday while my husband was at his family law consultation. I told her I needed a full picture of our financial situation, business and personal, and that I needed it to be quiet. She asked me how long I thought the irregularities had been going on. I said I didn't know yet if there were irregularities. She said, "You wouldn't be calling me if you weren't already sure." She was right. I had been doing our personal taxes for 12 years. I handled our household accounts. What I didn't have access to was the business he had restructured the ownership and accounting access 2 years earlier, during what he described as a back-office overhaul. He had given me a summary. I had accepted it. I hadn't pushed. That was the thing I kept coming back to in those first weeks. Not the betrayal, I hadn't confirmed that yet, but the moment I had stopped pushing. The precise point where I had decided to trust instead of verify. I'm not sure I had ever forgiven myself for being an analyst who had forgotten to audit her own life. Sandra needed 6 weeks. I gave her the access I had and she found what she needed from there. In the meantime, I went on living in our house, sleeping beside my husband, making coffee in the morning and dinner twice a week, attending the occasional work event on his arm. I smiled at the right times. I asked about his day. I was, by every external measure, exactly the wife he thought I was: present, unaware, unthreatening. Inside, I was working. I started by going through things I was legally entitled to see and simply hadn't looked at closely in years. Old tax filings. Business documents I'd helped draft. Partnership agreement, property records. I had good memory. One of the things about being an analyst is that you learn to hold a lot of information in order. To notice when something doesn't match what you saw before. Things didn't match. Vendor payments that had been regular for years had shifted, amounts changed, timing changed, names I didn't recognize had started appearing. Nothing obvious enough to be an accident. Subtle enough to look like accounting drift if you weren't looking carefully. I was looking carefully. The second thing happened about 3 weeks in, on a Sunday afternoon. My best friend came over for what we always called Sunday coffee, the standing invitation we'd had for the better part of a decade. She came in the same way she always had, through the side door without knocking, and I watched her face when she heard my husband's voice from upstairs. A small thing, a flicker. Gone in less than a second. I kept my hands around my mug and kept my voice level and watched her for the rest of the afternoon. She talked too much. She laughed at things that weren't quite funny. She left earlier than usual and hugged me longer than she normally would, the kind of hug that is also an apology. I sat in the kitchen after she left and thought about the calendar notification and the phone face down on every table and the business trips, and I put the last piece into place. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because people always ask about the moment you find out, and I think they expect something dramatic. What I felt was very quiet, the way the air feels just before a storm, when everything goes still and the temperature drops and there's a clarity to the light that's almost beautiful before it becomes terrifying. I was not going to cry. Not yet. Maybe not at all. I was going to finish what I started. Sandra's report came in mid-November. I drove to her office and she walked me through it across a conference table covered in documents and printed spreadsheets. And I followed every line because the numbers were mine. I had built that system. I understood its architecture, and what she showed me was that someone had been very methodically siphoning money out of the business for approximately 2 years. It was sophisticated. A series of vendor accounts that looked legitimate but traced back to LLCs with no real business activity. Payments structured carefully under reporting thresholds. A pattern that would have taken someone with real financial knowledge to construct. The total, as best as Sandra could determine, was somewhere north of $400,000. She told me she needed to refer this to a financial crimes attorney. I told her I knew, but I needed 2 more weeks before anything moved officially. She looked at me over the table and said, "What do you have planned?" I said, "I'm making sure there's nothing left for him to move before the walls close." She nodded. She gave me 2 weeks. What I did in those 2 weeks was this. I quietly, legally, and very carefully documented my own contributions to the business from its founding. Hours, intellectual property, financial systems I had built, contracts I had negotiated. I had emails. I had early drafts of documents in my name. I had records that I had never thought to save strategically, and now was deeply grateful existed. I also contacted an attorney of my own, a woman named Claire, a partner at a firm across town, who handled both divorce and business litigation. I had found her through Sandra. I sat in her office and laid out everything I had. The financial evidence, the documentation of my contributions, what I suspected about the personal situation. She asked me what outcome I wanted. I had thought about this carefully. I said, I want what I'm owed. I want the business malfeasance on record. And I want to walk out of this marriage without him having any claim over what I build next. She said that was achievable. I went home that night and made dinner and set the table for 2. And sat across from my husband while he talked about a client meeting, and I listened, and nodded and thought about nothing, except making sure my face stayed exactly the same as it always was. He didn't notice anything. He had stopped noticing me in any meaningful way a long time ago. That, in the end, was his most expensive mistake. I had one more thing to do before I was ready, and it was the hardest one. I had not confronted my best friend. I had been waiting partly for the evidence to be complete, partly because I needed to understand what I was walking into before I blew anything open. But I also needed to know how far the deception went. I called her on a Wednesday evening and asked if she wanted to grab dinner. Just us. She said yes, too quickly, with that same quality of voice she'd had on the Sunday that now felt like months ago. We met at a restaurant we'd been going to for years. We ordered what we always ordered. For the first 40 minutes, it was almost like it used to be the easy rhythm of a long friendship, the shorthand, the humor. And then I put my glass down and I looked at her and I said, "How long?" The color drained out of her face so completely that I would have felt sorry for her if I hadn't been holding myself very still against everything I was actually feeling. She said she didn't know what I meant. I said her name. Just her name. She looked down at the table. Her hands were shaking slightly. She said, "A little over a year." I had been right about the timeline. It lined up with when the money started moving. I didn't cry. I said, "Thank you for telling me the truth." I paid for my half of the dinner. I walked out. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock. Then I drove home. I was ready. Claire filed the divorce petition on a Monday morning in December. I had moved a portion of my personal savings money I had earned and kept in an account predating our marriage 2 weeks earlier, on Claire's advice, into a separate account in my name only. Everything was documented. Everything was clean. My husband was served at his office. He called me 7 times in the hour after. I let every call go to voicemail. When he came home that evening, his face had a quality I had never seen on it before, not anger, not even panic, but something underneath both of those. The particular expression of someone who has just discovered that the ground they've been standing on was not solid after all. He started with anger. He said I was being irrational, that we could work through this, that whatever I thought I knew I was wrong. I let him talk. Then I said, "I know about the vendor accounts. I know about the LLCs. I know about the money. And I know about her." The room went very quiet. He sat down. That was the moment I knew I had him, not by force, not by threat, but by the simple unmovable weight of the truth. There was nowhere for him to go. He asked how long I had known. I said, "Long enough." What followed was 3 months of legal process. He retained an attorney of his own, and the early exchanges were aggressive. He tried to claim the business was entirely his, that my contributions were informal and undocumented. Claire brought out the documentation. He tried to minimize the financial irregularities as accounting errors. Sandra's report had already been forwarded to the appropriate authorities. The matter was out of both our hands by then. He tried, once, to appeal to me directly. He showed up at the house on a Saturday morning with the kind of face people make when they've rehearsed remorse without fully feeling it. He said he'd made mistakes. He said he missed me. I opened the door and looked at him and said, "I know you believe that." I closed the door. My best friend reached out twice by text. I read both messages and didn't respond. There wasn't anything to say. The friendship, as I had understood it, had not existed for over a year. What I was mourning had already been gone for a long time before I knew to mourn it. That was the harder grief, honestly. Harder than the marriage. 12 years with someone can calcify into something that resembles a life without being one. But 22 years of a friendship that had been real, and its loss was a different kind of hollow. I let myself feel it. I just felt it on my own time, not on anyone else's schedule. The divorce was finalized in March. What I received, a settlement that included a significant portion of the business value, calculated using Sandra's figures rather than my husband's revised accounting. A cash settlement, the house, which I sold 3 months later. I didn't want to live in it, and the equity was mine to use. Documentation formally acknowledging my foundational contributions to the company's intellectual and operational infrastructure. What happened to him? The financial crimes investigation moved slowly, as they do, but it moved. His 2 business partners, neither of whom had known what he was doing, cooperated fully and ultimately separated from him formally. The company my husband had built, that I had in many ways built alongside him, continued under different leadership. He was not part of it. What happened to her? I genuinely don't know, and I found I didn't want to. The day the divorce was finalized, I drove to a coffee shop I'd never been to before, on a street I didn't have a history on, and I sat by the window and ordered a plain coffee, and I looked out at the ordinary mid-morning foot traffic, and I felt something I hadn't felt in longer than I could exactly identify. Clean. Not happy. That came later, in pieces, the way it actually comes. But clean. Cleared. Like the particular stillness of a room after it's been emptied and before it's been filled with anything new. I had been many things in those 6 months. Quiet when I wanted to scream. Still when I wanted to move. Patient in a way that cost me something real. But I had done it my way. With documentation and legal process and cold, careful precision. I had not burned anything down impulsively. I had not given him any warning that would have let him protect himself. I had simply waited until I had everything I needed, and then I had closed every door simultaneously. There is a particular kind of strength in knowing what you know and saying nothing. In doing the work in the dark. In trusting yourself enough to go slowly when everything in you wants to run. I'm not going to tell you it felt like justice. I'm not sure justice is the right word for the moment when a structure you built over 12 years comes down. There was no triumph. There was no scene. There was just a Tuesday morning in October when I found a calendar notification on an open laptop, and a version of me who had once stopped pushing decided she was done making that choice. I started my own consulting firm 4 months after the divorce. I took clients I had relationships with from my own professional history, not from his business, not from our shared network. Mine. The ones who had known me before him, and the new ones who would know me without reference to him at all. I kept the coffee shop on that unfamiliar street as my regular place to work on Tuesday mornings. I ordered the same plain coffee every time. I didn't need the window to feel like I could see clearly. But I liked it anyway.
Don't pity me. My heart doesn't need your mercy. I can still stand on my own. I was broken by your leaving. Fell deeper than I thought I would. But pain has taught me how to heal now and survive what once I couldn't. You don't have to look back sadly. Don't reach out with guilty hands. What you shattered made me stronger. Now I rise where I once collapsed. My heart doesn't need your pity. Not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow. I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling. I'll learn to breathe again. I once begged for your affection. Now I've learned my worth in scars. And the man you left in pieces found his own way through the dark. My heart doesn't need your pity. Not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow. I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling. I'll learn to breathe again. Begun. My heart doesn't need your pity. Not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow. I can stand through all the pain. I'm freezing, I'm bleeding, slowly fading away. But don't worry, I'm fine. The cold has settled in my heartbeat, like winter living in my veins. Every breath feels numb and fragile, every smile just hides the pain. I'm breaking quietly in silence, falling slow without a sound. Yet I keep saying I'm okay, while my world burns to the ground. I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. Maybe pain just learned to live here, maybe sorrow feels like home. So I wear my wounds like armor and survive them all alone. I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. If you ever see me smiling, no, it's just my last defense. 'Cause sometimes love means hiding how much you're suffering. No, I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. It's okay.